Record. Welcome back to the channel, guys. I'm joined today by Aron and by Stefan or Charlie Brown. I've had both of these gentlemen on. I do recommend the earlier episodes, and I'm very happy to be able to bring them together digitally. Um, Aron is back from his Mannheim talk. That's what I would like to lead off with. So please let us know, how was it to speak in front of people, to be there, to meet Stefan as well. I'm very curious.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for having me back on. I very much appreciate it. And it's also, Stefan, it's lovely to see you again. It was also like you for other people who might be viewing, it was kind of funny because, um, you know, Lucas and I have had this conversation, and there was like just this one guy who left like multiple comments underneath our video, underneath our conversation. So I was like, oh, cool, someone's actually engaging with this. And then all of a sudden, I got to the conference and I met Stefan, and he was like, I'm the one who commented on the video. So I was like, oh, that's you, no way. So it was amazing for me to just like kind of figure out who this person was, who was apparently interested in these two brothers talking about Nietzsche and such, and other stuff. And then I think finding out, like, especially, I mean, obviously the most obvious connection for all of us is this little corner. That's the most important connection. But then on the side there, finding out the Nietzsche and Goethe kind of connection was also very interesting. So that's just as a preface. The talk itself, yeah, I was very like, by the way, I was flattered by what you said about me in the last episode, Stefan. I very much appreciated that. um but I think I was actually, I was a bit nervous beforehand, specifically because I've been like teaching Nietzsche also for, like, let's say a couple of years now, and even the same week I had done a Nietzsche lecture. But I was kind of confronted on the fact uh, by my girlfriend and my dad, and they were like, like, this is not, a course. It's not like they're gonna need those PowerPoint slides with lots of text to prepare for their exams or for their paper. So you might as well just keep it simple. And that, all of a sudden, I was like, yeah, they're right. Actually, I don't need text on slides, but I'm also not actually used to like presenting without. But I really try to narrow it down as much as possible just to picture. So then you have like a useful visualization. And then that's also because I try to focus, um like I try to really tie it into the theme where it's not just about, these systematic ideas. Because if we've looked at the evolution of this little corner, it's kind of like, oh, these cool ideas that this weird, Peterson fella with his Vervaeke fella and Peugeot fella like are introducing. But it's actually like, no, we're getting to know each other, and now, like, through the years, the ideas are still important, but much more so as, let's say, an environment in which we can then um, get to know each other as people, in which we can have personhood. And that's why I wanted to focus on, okay, we've discussed Nietzsche's ideas quite often, I'd say, like, at least from, every now and then he's brought up by someone like Peterson. He's brought up very rarely, but sometimes by Vervaeke, is also in the series, and also very rarely, but sometimes by Peugeot. And I was like, let's just focus on who he was first, to just contextualize it, because that's what this is about for all of us, to really, to not just zero in on, what do we have to say when we come to this, but also what is our story? Like, how did we get to caring about these ideas? And I think that's also, I guess, what I try to do in my uh, in my own research with Nietzsche. I think it's especially appropriate, and maybe also with Goethe. We can talk about that in a little bit. But because he is also like, it's not about these abstract ideas. Like, it's much more interesting to ask yourself the question, like, why are they writing them? Like, who is writing it? Like, what are they trying to prove? Like, and why would that matter? So I started off with talking about his life. Then I started off with talking about that in light of what we know about his life, about what he wrote himself, his personal letters, like, how do we then look at his ideas? And then to sort of combine that into, like, so what could be his place in this little corner and something to talk about? And even though I was nervous at the start because the format was kind of new for me, I just asked the question to Paul during, because it was like, it could be interesting to compare, Nietzsche being the son of a pastor, to Paul and what that was like. And I think that got me a little bit more relaxed. And everyone was just super attentive. So I really appreciated how much everyone was listening. And that's also like, I actually had to rush through time at the end. Like I would have loved to have more time, but that's why we have these types of conversations. So it was just kind of I think a good pitch. And I think it ended up tying in very well with some of the other themes that were discussed actually during the day. So opponent processing was already brought up. The balance between the masculine and the feminine was brought up. So there were all these elements that allowed for the presentation to have a much better place than I actually would have even hoped for sort of at first. So very thankful for that. And I think it went well, but that's like, I have to re-listen to it myself, like I don't know, but I was happy with it, and I was happy with the reception. So sorry, long story, but that's it.
We like the long stories around here. So thank you for sharing that. I told Aron offline already that I'm looking forward to watching it myself. I haven't watched it at all, so that'll be very exciting. I brought you two guys together. Well, actually, I think you guys brought yourselves together here, and I'm the mediator, I guess, um, because I think there's a lot of interesting things to discuss with both of your backgrounds, and I feel Aron is kind of representing a bit Nietzsche's ideas, and Stefan is a bit like representing Goethe's ideas, and I'd like to get those two talking to each other a little bit. And one thing I was thinking about was how both of these people would have responded to the modern age. I'd be very curious if you guys have any insights, what you think, how they would how they would look at our problems, how like for example, they would respond to all these phenomena. This is very hard to do, but I think it is a fun exercise to do nonetheless. It also can give me a bit more of an insight into who these figures are because I know so much less than you two. So I'd like to give Stefan an opportunity to say a bit more about
Well,
Goethe and perhaps that.
that's a great question, and it's a wonderful pitch to actually start to begin with Goethe, and I would like to tie it to the way that Aron framed his Nietzsche talk. Is that you can't understand Goethe when you read a poem from him or a play from him. That's just a piece of art, and it stands for itself, true, and it's brilliant, absolutely. But once you start looking into his biography, that's when all the lights, turn on. And once you realize how he's set in his own history, in the historical movements that were taking place between his birth and his death, it's insane. It's absolutely insane. He was an observer of the French Revolution. He was an observer of the end of the Roman Empire, of the German nation, and the Accords of Vienna in 1850.
Right. So just the Holy Roman Empire, right?
Yeah, the Holy Roman Empire
yeah.
of German nation, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, he saw that. And his first play that made him famous was the Götz von Berliching. And in Götz von Berliching, he depicts this old knight figure, Götz von Berliching, not as someone running against other, feudal systems, but against modernity itself. Because the king or the emperor that he has to, follow, he's now surrounded by all these bureaucrats and the judges and the lawyers. And they, dissect everything into, how can we turn that into another rule or, another procedure? And he's still this very masculine figure from the old age trying to, get through it. And in the end, he dies. And that's just the logical conclusion of the whole play, is that this old type of masculine power dies in the new bureaucratic system. It can't survive, which is funny because if you look further into Goethe's biography, he became part of the bureaucracy of the Duke of Karl August of Weimar Saxony. He was the privy councillor to him. And that's just such an interesting twist because, okay, you start with that play and then you actually go exactly in that direction, which says already a lot about the openness that Goethe essentially had. He was open to everything and anything at any time. He nothing was sacred to him in that sense. And at the end of his life, which is also interesting, he wrote a poem, and it's just such a funny story. I think he was 79, and he proposed to marry a 17-year-old girl. And he did not propose directly, but he had his friend, the Duke of Weimar, Karl August, propose to the mother of that girl, and she friendly declined. And so he was absolutely shattered by it. And he wrote one of the most beautiful poems that he ever wrote. It's the Marienbad Elegies. And he basically writes all the emotions that he has at the loss of this love. He writes he started writing that poem while he was riding home back from the hotel where he had stayed and that girl had stayed, and he had tried to propose to her. And in that poem, he says, all that the gods have given their favorites, I have received, the good and the suffering, all of it. So if you look at that, I think it ties pretty well into why Nietzsche would see in him this Übermensch figure, because Goethe did not shy away from experiences that, caused intense suffering for him. But at the same time, he also experienced all the joy possible in a human life. And still at the end of his life, he was unsure what to make of it. He had this kind of existentialist dread to it at the end of his life. And looking at all his plays and all his writing as well, there's one thing he intentionally always defied, and that was death. If someone were to die or something was to die, he was not going to have it. There's an anecdote from the beginning of his life that I think it was his younger brother, he died, and he did not mourn the death. He was around 7 years old, I guess. He did not mourn the death, but he was angry at his mother that now he wasn't able to teach his younger brother what he had already prepared that he was wanting to teach him.
Wow.
This is really, really tough if you look at him. And
Yeah.
then there's an even stronger anecdote. That's his wife. I mean, they were in a long relationship out of wedlock, and somewhere in time they did get married. But so she was sick. She was terminally ill, and she was in excruciating pain. And they were in the same house, but he could not stand it. So actually, he got sick himself and went to another room and closed his ears. And so she died a few days later in the room in solitude. And he did not even go to the burial ceremony. And at the same day that his wife had died, and I mean, he immensely suffered, and he did that as well when his children died. There were some kids that died, and he wrote to Schiller, and he had experiences of that suffering as well. But generally, he tried to stay away from it wherever possible. And at the same time at the same day his wife died, he has this in his diary. He says, "Okay, wife dies at 12 a.m. In the afternoon, preparations for some laboratory experiments. In the night, going for a walk," something like that. And it's like, what on earth is going on with this man? Yeah. This is just yeah. So that's, maybe I should wrap it up then. And
No, that's great. That's really good stuff. I had no idea about this this side, let's say, to Goethe. I feel like we're only scratching the surface of your Goethe knowledge. So that's really awesome. I think it's a great way to start it. I don't know, Aron, do you want to like respond a bit to this, or do you want to go into the direction of Nietzsche, or what do you think?
Well, so just to tie it also, because like this was super useful to tie it to Luca's question. So how do you think he would look at our contemporary society, right? Can you just expand on that first, and then maybe we can...
If it's an interesting thing to pursue.
No, one thing is he saw it coming. As I've said, with his Götz of Berliching and the other place, he saw that coming already. He also saw the extremes of this emotional, solipsistic romanticism that would be a result as a reaction to modernity. He saw that in his Werther, the Sorrows of Young Werther.
Right.
And he was disappointed by the reaction of the public to that work, actually, because he thought he had made it abundantly clear that that was a kind of extreme form of satire.
Right.
That people should see this is what happens if you go into that direction at the extreme. But then it turned out to be like this kind of trend. It was the people were wearing exactly the clothes that Goethe had described Werther was wearing. And it's not totally clear, but there seems to be some base for the information that actually there were a lot of suicides surrounding the reading of the Werther, and it was mostly male people between 20 and 24, something like that. And so story goes that there were thousands of suicides in Europe because of that. And of course, he was not very happy with that. But I mean, what do you do when something like that happens? You create another epoch. It's like he had the Storm and Stress epoch. He founded that with Götz von Berliching. Then he had Romanticism with Werther. And then he said, well, let's do Classicism. That's what you do next, don't you? So that's the one side. He saw many things coming already. And if you think about his most important work, the Faust, which consists of two parts mostly, you only know the first part with the Gretchen allegory, but actually the second part is much more important because there he clearly lays out all the things happening in modernity. And he wrote that at a later stage, but his initial ideas he already had like in the 1760s, 1770s. And from then on, he started working on it continuously. And I think the Goethe 2, the Faust 2 was actually only published after his death. So there was the part 1 that was published before that, and the part 2 was only published afterwards. And so I think he realized already that he was not part of that modernity itself any longer. But he saw it, he had a prophetic vision of what was to come. And he wrote that into his work. And since I think in a sense, he knew that what was going to remain in time was his work. So from the beginning on, he was very careful in preparing his own profile. So there are like 20,000 letters to him that are still available, but most of the letters that he wrote, he destroyed. No, the other way around, right?
Right.
So most of the stuff that he wrote, he carefully chose to keep, but the letters he received, he mostly destroyed. And he did that with like every person that he loved and that he had a relationship with. If at all, there's just like 1 or 2 letters available from them. And you can only hint that there had been letters because he writes in other letters, oh, I'm sorry, I wrote that in that letter, and maybe we should just keep it as it is, and I'll be fine and whatever. So it's really interesting that he already did this profile curation,
Right.
and a lot of auto da fe destruction, stuff that did not fit into this frame, which makes him, I think, an extremely modern figure already.
Wait, so I have a question, because like I know that I totally agree with what you just said about, or at least from what I know, right? Like, but it sounds like it makes a lot of sense that he wrote the Sorrows of Young Werther as kind of like, just this almost like, okay, just be aware this is where this kind of life leads. And the great thing about Goethe is like, also because he's a great artist, that it's also in the form. So like I think that book is like, it's an epistolary novel, right? So it's mostly through letters from the young Werther himself. And I think that's so interesting that on the one hand, he said, this is not the life you should lead. And at the same time, the form remains constant, that he is actually, that that what he decides to do is just keep his own letters, even though like I think like in the reading of young Werther, you get the sense that part of the form there of just reading his letters is kind of part of the problem, right? Like you're only reading his thoughts. It's only him, and that's actually part of the problem, that he's like very much self-obsessed. By the way, like I have lots of criticisms of Nietzsche, so if you're uncomfortable with me potentially criticizing Goethe, or just let me know. But for me, it's always like, I love these people, and I'm full of criticisms of them. So I'm curious, do you think of that as something he did on purpose, or is that just like sort of a weakness that he decided to also in that same way just be like, I'm gonna be this person you're only gonna read my letters, not the response to it, you're just gonna read me, and therefore yes, I am inspiring people to kill themselves. Okay.
I don't know, because at least with regards to the young Werther, the stories of the young Werther, if you're familiar with Rousseau wrote an epistolary novel, Julie, or the Nouvelle Héloïse. And that basically is the blueprint for Goethe's Werther, because it's also in this letter form, and at the end of Héloïse dies, and at the end of Werther dies. So there's a really interesting connection between Goethe and Rousseau as well. And it goes so far, actually, that Goethe literally imitates Rousseau while he's in Italy. If you've read or heard of Carl Truman, he did this book about okay, so
it's about the self, right? And about
basically about the invention of the sacred self in modernity, and where Rousseau ties in. And there's this scene that Truman relates to, where Rousseau is in Italy and he has the first contact with a prostitute. I think it is in Venice. And there, Rousseau finally realizes what was wrong with him all the time. And Goethe has that experience as well with the woman he finally calls Faustina in Rome. And so he goes to Rome as well. He goes to Italy. He has sexual experience there. He comes back as a new man, as did Rousseau when he returned from Italy. And so there's a lot of imitation going on there. And in that sense, if someone imitated Werther, Goethe must have had some kind of expectation about that already, because he was imitating Rousseau himself while writing that letter, or writing the novel.
Mm-hmm.
So I think maybe that's part of an explanation.
Right. No, it's great. Okay, that's super informative. Okay, should I talk a little bit about Nietzsche, Lucas? Like,
that's
about
good. Yeah.
Well, okay, so like obviously the question with someone, so just like while you were talking about Goethe, I was like, okay, now I can totally see why Nietzsche loved Goethe so much, and I can also just already just state very bluntly, like Goethe was like a great individual, like he was a great man, and obviously like they also have, all great men have their flaws, but Nietzsche was great in his writing, and he was fairly pathetic, in his life, and just in the sense like not just like pathetic, like but just kind of sad, that you just kind of you would have wanted more for him, but he didn't really get much out of it, even though he probably he did live in gorgeous places. So he also ended up, but that was for the sake of his health. He ended up traveling a lot, living in different places for his respiratory health, mostly, that he lived in Switzerland and in Italy and in France, all these gorgeous locations. Having said that, I don't think he lived a great life. And in terms of like, okay, his influence, or like how would he have looked at our time today, it's really hard to say, because so much of it is also anticipated by him and partially also influenced by him, right? So it's difficult to say. So what Stephan said about Goethe and young Werther, and then influencing people to commit suicide, in that same sense you could, or in a different way, but similarly, you could argue, that some of Nietzsche's writing have been taken by the Nazis, and have precisely taken the wrong teachings from it and then perverted it. At the same time, there's also something to be said, and that's why we should always be critical. Like, okay, yes, but there is something in there which lends itself to that, and that is always, something we should be super very much aware of. However, if we look at the work as a whole and the person as a whole, then, for instance, in the person of Nietzsche, it's clear that he was very much anti-Semitic, because he thought it was just a pathetic kind of resentment-driven life. So he would have despised that. But having said that, like there are also elements in Nietzsche and also in Goethe, obviously, who was also in some sense, we should say it, I think he was also accused of inspiring that, romantic nationalist movement that ended up inspiring the Nazis in some ways. But we can talk about that in a little bit later. But that was, that, and in that sense, you can see an inspiration that he also influenced, or at least contributed, or made it facilitated. You don't want to make it too strong, because this possibly also would have happened, without these individuals, but they do facilitate it in some ways, because they were used in some ways by these individuals or by these movements. So having said that, like, you can see that with Nazism in a different way. You can see someone like Nietzsche anticipating someone like Freud, with looking at, like, okay, it's about our deeper intentions that are not transparent to ourselves, and we should be aware of that. You could see him foreshadowing someone like Foucault, who is like, okay, what's actually interesting if we look at the history of societies is not to look at these specific individuals and what we've written about it, but just look at, like, what are actually the underlying power dynamics at play, which actually still inform our relationship today, and therefore that behind certain concepts that, or certain values we have, there might actually be power relations at play. And that's obviously became very Foucauldian. And he was concerned about the thing that Rousseau had inspired, which was kind of like just this romantic back to nature, which he actually appreciated in Goethe, but he hated in Rousseau. It's kind of very interesting. We could talk about that, because for Rousseau, he really thought of it as, like, just getting away from this life, because this life is too difficult, and therefore imagining this other world. And in that sense, that inspired sort of the revolution, but it was from also this sense of resentment, like this resentment against the society at large, against the people who were ruling. And he found that profoundly associated then in socialism. So he says, like, socialism, they're in some ways under the guise of this Rousseauian spirit, which is very resentment driven. So even though he didn't know the works of Marx, he could have anticipated that something like that would eventually ended up in just a huge chaos. So my point is, it's super difficult, I think, to really argue what Nietzsche would say of today, because so much of it he anticipated. So he would have just, like, said, like, told you, like, that would happen. At the same time, there is something to be said for the fact that he was still arguing against the last remainder of, let's say, Christian dominance, so it's because he was the one who announced that God is dead, and he said, oh, but people don't know it yet. And it will be interesting to see, because he also writes, I think in it's actually in his unpublished fragments, but it ends up being published in The Will to Power, by his sister. But he said, like, what I'm relating here is the history of the next 200 years, right? And he says that in 1880, so that's still 50 years from now, or a little bit more, like 56, 57 to be precise. So it's hard to see, because maybe he's like, this process is still ongoing. I think I would be very interested to know what he would have thought of some of these, like, healthist cultures, these people going online and like, if I can be so frank, kind of like the start of your own channel, Lucas, like, kind of just to and I'm not saying there's anything
The Huberman.
wrong. Yeah, like the Huberman, exactly, the Andrew Huberman kind of corner of this, which you coined, I think, in a very lovely way. But I'm curious what he would have thought of that, because at the same time, there's also something about that which is not the positive self-evaluation that he would have liked, and is much more like, you know, is still sharing to other people and still like relating yourself to, for instance, an Excel file with how many calories have you eaten today, and it still has all these problems, which actually he would have related to asceticism, and is not like the fullness of life, but is also keeping yourself from it. So I don't know. And the problem with Nietzsche is he was just messed up, you know, like he ended up being so profoundly confused about so many things, he ended up turning insane. So I would also need to know, like, okay, which Nietzsche are we talking about? Are we talking about early Nietzsche, middle Nietzsche, late Nietzsche? And you probably have the same a little bit with Goethe. But I think for many cases, he would have said, like, right, yes, I thought this was going to happen. I don't think it would have been surprised by what was going to happen.
Yeah.
I would also be curious, as a final thing, you know, how would he look at this reemergence of Christianity that is happening in this little corner? Would he think of us as being like, you know, life denying, or is this actually the pure Christianity that like you've seen my writing about this, Lucas? You know, the pure Christianity that he so appreciated, and does this actually have an opportunity to maybe integrate the Nietzschean criticism, but mostly to value like the pureness that was at the heart of Christ's life and the Christ message, you know, which he also praised in the Antichrist, ironically. So I mostly have questions, not so much like statements. You know, this is what he
Oh,
would have.
that's great. I mean, it's very much in line with his volatile thoughts about the world that you have all these questions. So
Yeah.
I think they're very fun to explore. Stefan, do you have any comments thus far about what
Yeah,
Aron has said?
that was extremely helpful and clarifying for me, because I think in that sense you could actually put Goethe on the opposite of that, in a sense that Goethe was always very open to anything that involved change, evolution. So he had this sense of fluidity to identity that is a very modern concept in that sense, and that we are currently struggling with. That things seem to have gone off the rails and become absolutely fluid without any polarity any longer. And I'm not quite sure whether Goethe would have had any trouble with that, because he was so flexible in his thinking and in his behavior, and he wasn't afraid of, you know, stepping into any possible situation. He pushed himself actually to move in situations that were uncomfortable for him, because he realized he could learn something out of that, and that would assist him in evolving. And there's reason actually to think that he was one of the forethinkers of evolution theory before Darwin as well. So there's a connection there. And I wanted to add this to your interest, Aaron, Goethe's Allegories of Identity by Jane Brown. It's a phenomenal book, and I'm just going to read the blurb. A century before psychoanalytic discourse codified a scientific language to describe the landscape of the mind, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe explored the paradoxes of an interior self separate from a conscious self. Though long acknowledged by the developers of depth psychology and by its historians, Goethe's literary rendering of an interiority has not been the subject of detailed analysis in itself. And she goes lengths at actually explaining the work of Goethe being the link between Rousseau and Freud.
Right.
So in a sense, he was the stepping stone for many of those that were to come after him. And Freud, of course, he was a Goethe fan. He was a Goethe fanboy, and he received himself for his work the Goethe Prize. So you can see there's already a lot of connections there with Goethe and Freud and all the psychoanalysis that's taking place. And indeed, if you look at many of his works, what happens is that the main actors don't act in a sense that it's participation in the scene, but they turn to themselves and they have this interior view of things. And so there's a lot of an analytical drama taking place.
Yeah.
And one of the most famous works for that is actually, I think, Goethe's Iphigenia of Tauris, which is, you could say, a profoundly anti-Christian play, because Iphigenia does not sacrifice herself, but actually says, if the gods exist, they beat within my chest. And so what happens is she's being taken back to the court and doesn't have to sacrifice herself. So it's a very subversive re-messaging of the Christian
Right.
story.
But this is also like, so that does seem like in that sense he went partially inspired it, but also went along a little bit with his time, was this the whole romantic movement was about this focus on feeling as opposed to the intellect, and about, and even someone like Feuerbach, who Marx actually took a lot from, but Feuerbach, who argued that what we think of as God is actually just this projection of this inadequacy that we're feeling, and by projecting this God outside of ourselves, we're actually keeping ourselves from getting this human potential. So like I totally see that there's like this is in the air, right? It's happening all around, and I do also think I can also make a link to Freud a little bit, because Freud actually argued that he had never read Nietzsche to get at his own work, so it might indeed be that that he was less influenced by that. He did also say about Nietzsche when he did read him, like, oh, this was probably the man who knew himself best in all of history. So that's kind of interesting, that he thought so of Nietzsche. And obviously Freud did have relations with Lou Andrea Salome, who I talked about during the talk, who was in a very personal relationship with Nietzsche, who got to know his mind, got to know his works, and actually became a psychoanalytic thinker herself. So it's also like possible that through that there's a little bit of a connection. But I've also like once heard I think Raymond Goethe, like he mentioned, like, okay, the comment of Freud saying he hasn't read Nietzsche is a little bit of like a political theorist today saying they haven't read Rawls. And you might not know Rawls, but Rawls is a very prominent political thinker. It's like he's like the main sided person. It's kind of like, and the reason why he made that
final exam on Rawls, actually.
Okay, right.
So yes,
so you know exactly what this is about. But you see the comparisons, kind of, yeah. You might not read him, but he is like just in the environment, like the whole academia has soaked him up at that point. So I think it's very, yeah. It's hard to say where the connection is actually coming from, but I do definitely think, and that's why like something that Goethe and Nietzsche just share so profoundly is just their that struggle in romanticism. Like they're both so romantic and both anti-romantic at the same time. Like they're both, you could see it, like, and which is also why they're great, because they're aware of the limitations of romanticism, and at the same time they're also their whole style fits the whole romantic movement. So it's yeah, I find that a very interesting parallel.
Which is why you have to be careful when you're reading Goethe's works not to fall into the trap of thinking that that this figure is actually what Goethe intended to tell us of that play. It's like, no, maybe he's not Faust, maybe he's Mephistopheles, or maybe he's Gretchen, maybe he's all of them. Yeah. And Goethe would say, yes, of course, it's obvious that it runs through everything. Yeah. And so he had this knack of being able to just hold a position opposite to himself.
Yeah.
Just for the sake of having this polarity.
Yeah.
Because he believed that this kind of polarity created the forces that made it possible to transform something or to evolve.
Yeah.
And so
I also like that opponent's processing.
Yeah. So he deliberately enjoyed setting things against each other and see how that plays out.
Right.
And he does that in a brilliant play as well, in the Wahlverwandtschaft, the what's it called in English? The elective. I have to look it up. But it's basically two married couples in a setting where they're together on a weekend, and let's see what plays out. And it's fascinating that at the end, these couples switch, and then there's suicide and all that kind of stuff. So all those traditional marriage ideas, they derail completely in that play.
Yeah, I know.
And you think, is that what Goethe was thinking about marriage? And I would say no. He's really experimenting with things and trying to think them to their logical conclusion. What could happen if? and he enjoys that.
Yeah, and so I'm not sure if this is also in the air or if Nietzsche is inspired by this, but that was kind of also my point with, like that Nietzsche, Apollo and Dionysus and the crucified and Dionysus, but also like he sometimes says Buddha versus the crucified. So like there's all these, he actually says at some point, like, I just love antagonisms. I think at some point he reflects on the fact that he feels so lonely since his relationship with his friendly relationship with Wagner is over. And he says like, and it's not even that I'm annoyed with the fact that we now stand opposed to each other. I actually love opposition. It's just that I'm lonely, like he just clarifies that. And I think there's also something to be said that that's what Nietzsche really appreciated in Dostoevsky, like that he saw that Dostoevsky was able to battle it out against these opposing characters. So I think that's very important for them both, Goethe and Nietzsche, to not just be like, okay, because like they're, in that sense, they're both actually, and I wanted to respond to that. Nietzsche is also pro fluidity. Like he's not against, he doesn't want stable identities. Like he's very, very concerned with that. And that's also why he so appreciated someone like Jesus, because he was like, Jesus was against everything that was fixed, like he was constantly just like in flow, but like more in the Tao sense. The problem with obviously today is that people think that fluid identity is something that they can just decide, and that's something very different. So I'm not sure if he would appreciate that part, but I definitely see parallels there, and like the difference in how we're approaching it now is that Nietzsche read so much of Goethe, and obviously Goethe had no clue who Nietzsche was. So that's also why I think like it's obvious that Nietzsche was so much more influenced by Goethe than the other way around. But yeah, I see a lot of interesting stuff, and this is clarifying a lot for me, which I'm definitely going to use. Lucas, did you have any questions right up till now? I'm not sure if we're still being your.
There's no plan. I figured if I get like a couple of things going, then you will take it and run. And that's exactly what happened. So I'm very pleased with that. I was wondering, as you were speaking, you said that Nietzsche was very influenced by Goethe. So maybe this is a hard question to even begin to think about, because you can't really split him from Goethe. But maybe for Stephan, how do you think Goethe would have looked at someone like Nietzsche and his ideas? Do you think that, like, how do you think he would have?
He would have entertained any thought that what was presented to him.
Okay.
That's the short answer, because he was so literate and well versed in everything at his time. His father was wealthy. He did not have to work. He was very well educated himself, and so what he did was he educated Goethe the best possible way. So at the age of 7 already, and then later on, he spoke Latin and Hebrew and French and Italian. And so he learned the Bible in Hebrew. He read it and he could, recite it by heart. And the same with all the Greek and the Roman classics. So there's already a lot of groundwork that's, being done there. So Goethe can relate to everything at any point in time.
Well, I do have one quick question about that.
Yeah.
Because I once heard an anecdote, and I'm not sure if it's true, so you can correct me, but that Hegel, once he finished his Phänomenologie des Geistes, so his phenomenology of spirit, I think he actually showed it to Goethe. Like, it was like, what do you think of it? And the Goethe was like, I can't understand this, like, which makes a lot of sense because no one could understand Hegel. So like, I'm not saying Goethe was a dumbass for not understanding it, but I am saying that Hegel would later become like a very prominent, important thinker. And when he first released it, everyone was like, "What the hell is this?" Including Goethe. So I'm curious, how do you look at that? Like that he wasn't. If that is true, by the way, if that anecdote.
I haven't read that anecdote, but it seems to me to be plausible, for the mere fact that Goethe, as Privy Councillor, was responsible for the universities in Weimar, Saxony, and for example, responsible for who got the professorships at the University of Jena. So at the request of Schiller, he actually got Fichte a professorship in Jena.
Right.
And so there's this direct connection between them. And Goethe was, he was a contemporary of Kant, and he read the works of him as well. And and so he was very open to new ideas. And there's this magnificent book, magnificent, funny, because Andrea Wolf titled the book Magnificent Rebels, about the so-called Jena set. And the Jena set was a bunch of people living at the same time in Jena.
Yeah.
And it was Schelling, the Schlegel brothers, it was Fichte, it was Schiller, it was Goethe.
This is, by the way, a colleague of mine is like totally focused on precisely like that moment in history, those people. Yeah.
So I think it, and later on, he wrote the Far Eastern Divan, der fernöstliche Divan, where he, you know, is so open to also include Islam and Eastern thought into his own thinking, translate things, poeticize them as well. So he had an extreme openness to any idea, and he was also, I think, Schopenhauer knew him personally as well.
Really?
Yeah. Oh. So there's a direct connection between them as well. It's like, okay, you know, Goethe, of course, Goethe knows everyone else, and can I talk to him? Yeah, sure, let's talk. So they probably met and you know, mixed up at several times in their lives. And so I would think that if Goethe were to meet Nietzsche, he would have listened to him, he would have enjoyed it, and at the end of it, maybe he read something of Nietzsche, and then he makes up something totally different and says, that's my take on it.
Right.
Like, he read Spinoza, but he was very careful to say, I don't think Spinoza would agree with what I'm putting into him because it's my personal interpretation of him. But it works for me and it's wonderful, so I'm going to stick to that. And he would have done the same probably with Nietzsche and said, you know, this is really, he's a brilliant thinker and I love him. And maybe, yeah, I take that idea. And so I'm a Nietzschean.
Yeah.
But just for the sake of being able to, you know, have the position of Nietzsche without actually being his own position.
Right, yeah. By the way, I was just looking for the anecdote and I couldn't quickly find it. So I just want to be aware of the I just want to make it explicit that it's not actually sure this happened. So
it was a dream.
Maybe.
All right. Is there more that you guys wanna say on this topic specifically? Otherwise, I have some directions, but I think it's still quite interesting to pursue if you guys
have a question with regards to Nietzsche, because I know that Goethe was really influenced by Spinoza and the natural theology of Spinoza, which made it very easy for him to see everything as part of God, basically. Right. You know, to have this pantheist or at least panentheist view of reality made it very easy for him to say, well, you know, the good and the bad, the ugly and the beautiful, that's all just a manifestation of God in reality. And so I'm participating in it, which is wonderful. So like deification or theosis in that sense. How would Nietzsche would have approached that question?
Yeah, so it's interesting, like Nietzsche at some point, he discovers Spinoza and he is like just amazed. But I should already add to this, like I think the most common theory is that Nietzsche did never read Spinoza directly. Like he read it like as like in secondary literature about Spinoza, but he read it and he was like, whoa, that's amazing. And he writes to a friend like, oh my God, I have a precursor. Like, and what a precursor. He says, you know, like I profoundly relate to Spinoza on what is it, like about his judgment on good and evil, his judgment about free will, and he lists all these things that they agree upon. And it's very interesting, like with so many figures, including Goethe to some extent, but less so than with other figures. But like with so many figures, he actually ends up disagreeing with them later. And that's why I think already in that first letter where he's so enthusiastic about Spinoza, he says like, you know, all the differences that there are between us are just cultural, you know, like they're so I can kind of disregard them. But then later on, he does think that, for instance, he actually takes over some concept of Spinoza, or at least he contrasts his own concepts with those of Spinoza. So, for instance, Spinoza has the concept of the conatus, you know, which is kind of like it's everything's drive to self-preserve. that's kind of how we can understand it. Whereas for Nietzsche, obviously, is like, yeah, okay, that sounds very Darwinian almost, you know, like evolution and wants to preserve itself. He's like, no, that's wrong. Darwin is wrong. Spinoza is wrong. Everything is will to power, you know, like everything wants to expand. Everything wants to, and he could tell this because, like, in some sense, there's all these, he experiences a multitude of personalities, which is also why he was, you know, a proto psychoanalytic thinker in himself, that all wanted to have a say. Like they didn't just want to be preserved, they all wanted to expand in some ways. And he looked at history as just, you know, like you could see that the slave morality, as he called it, you know, like it was kind of being suppressed for such a long time that it had to work in a different way to eventually dominate again. So he's like, that was also the will to power for slave morality. Even something like that, which seems to despise power, ends up wanting to be very powerful. So that was his first like major disagreement with Spinoza. And then another thing, like a famous dictum of Spinoza is actually Deus sive natura. So it's like, you know, God or nature. And that's what you just described, is like that God and nature are the same, but conceived of indeed in a panentheist sense. So like, you know, they're eternal and they're absolute and they're necessary. So nature has a far more divine aspects than, let's say, how Sam Harris would look at nature, just to give a stupid example. But Nietzsche actually transforms that, and he says, okay, no, it's chaos sive natura, chaos sive natura. So he's much more, he says like, okay, yes, nature, but it's the same as chaos. So it's like, it's not that when you learn to know nature, you see perfect harmony everywhere, which is kind of what someone like Goethe took also from Spinoza, I think, I hear you saying. It's like, no, but you also see chaos, and you see a lot of things that actually or go against this stability. So that's another thing. And then finally, Spinoza has this dictum of the amor dei intellectualis, which for him is like, you know, the highest thing he wants to achieve, which is the intellectual love of God, which is also why Spinoza has often also been taken in a mystical sense, that if you get that, like you become truly one with nature, you become one with God, and that's for him the intellectual love of God. And Nietzsche just takes that too, but he changed the amor dei to amor fati. Like, no, you should love your fate. You know, you should love this life as it presents itself to you. So, as with so many figures, it's hard to see what Nietzsche thought of them himself, but he constantly used something as a way to become better, because it was also consistent with his own philosophy, right? It's because kind of like, okay, wow, I discovered this great individual like a Schopenhauer or like a Spinoza, and then later on, like, no, actually they were just full of shit, and now I've integrated like the best parts of them, but I've transformed it, like, you know, in such a way that I'm now greater than them in that regard. He wouldn't easily say it that way, but that's kind of what I take from it. So I'm not sure if that's like a response to your question. You can kind of see like that he appreciates some elements of it, but other elements, you know, like they're both naturalists, but not naturalists in the same way. So
I
yeah,
really appreciate that. Thanks. That's
good.
very helpful, because I have to admit, I haven't read a lot of Nietzsche, and I have not read Spinoza at all. So I only know of both via Goethe, basically, and the connections between the others.
Yeah.
Though I realize that Spinoza is, I think, also very important to understand, at least in part, what are some of the tensions that are in this little corner.
Right. Yeah.
And so it's not just that Viveki is proposing, in a sense, a Spinozist or Spinozan type of religion that is not a religion. But I think that there's more to Spinoza there. And
right.
I would like to dive into that, because I think it clarifies, it will clarify for me a lot of the discussions taking place around here.
Yeah, and it's also, and with Spinoza, you have the similar problem that I presented in my talk, which is like, was Spinoza an atheist or was he very religious? It's like, no, you have both of those things again with him too. And I would, by the way, also say, so I don't think this individual grasped the personalities of Spinoza and Nietzsche perfectly, but just for the sake of, like, let's say, perspectival knowledge, it's very nice to read Irvin de Jalom's novels on both Spinoza and on Nietzsche. So I think the Spinoza problem is what he wrote partially about this Nazi commander Rosenberg, who, you know, discover Spinoza, but he's like, yeah, but he's a Jew. And then he's like, oh, but Goethe liked Spinoza, so there must be something good about him. And then he starts reading Spinoza. So that's one part of the story, and the other part is Spinoza's life. Oh, you might have read it. I'm not sure.
No, I
But
haven't.
oh, okay, yeah, but and so you get to know Spinoza's life a little bit, and he is always about historical fiction. So I think he always says, Irvin Yalom does, like, I like to write about what could have happened, but didn't precisely happen this way. So all of this could have happened, and which is also why in the Nietzsche novel he writes about Nietzsche, and mostly Nietzsche having therapy sessions from Breuer, who was also very important in the psychoanalytic movement, who wasn't actually like his doctor, and then that's alternated between Breuer then talking to Freud and being like, oh yeah, I have this really cool patient, Nietzsche is fascinating, but kind of a weird type, which didn't actually happen, but it all could have happened. Like, it all works out chronologically, and it's this very nice way of perspectively getting into like their lives and what it must have been like for them, even though, again, like, I don't think like he's not like a proper scholar on these individuals, so he didn't know them like perfectly, but he knew them well enough to just get you a proper feel for both of them. And Spinoza, I've read parts of the theological political treatise and parts of the emendation of the intellect and parts of the ethics, but never like a complete work. So I also have lots to learn there. Yeah, but I totally agree with you. Like, I think it would be super interesting to look at the specifics of that, because also like Vervaeke does like Lectio Divina on Spinoza, and he, like, for him, it's Spinoza is really one of the main figures for him, in which he sees himself and through which he sees the world. So I want to know more about that, right? Like, and not just because I want to get to know John better, but also because I genuinely think, like, okay, John is onto something, but also, even if John is not onto something, it might be interesting to figure out what are the tensions, as you say, in this little corner. So there's so much more.
Do you know where people could start to read Spinoza?
In terms of
Like, where would you begin to
right.
understand his thought properly? Do you have any idea?
Yeah, so like a colleague of mine is a Spinoza expert, so like
Okay,
I'm a bit self-conscious now, like that.
all good.
But I would say, um, it's difficult to say, but I think the emendation of the intellect felt far more, yeah, just a little bit more easy to read for me, and
Mhm.
I just read like a part of that on the emendation of the intellect. Then the ethics is very difficult. It's like is extremely. It's like, it's almost like you're reading a geometrical work.
Okay.
So it's the ethics, but it's not precisely about ethics. It's very much metaphysics, and then it ends up being about ethics and epistemology and all that. But it's a very precise work, very dry. But
Yeah.
then, Vervaeke talked to what was her name, Claire Carlyle, who ends up arguing that that's precisely the book that shows the religious nature of Spinoza if you read it in a certain manner. So there's more for that, but not as a starting work. And the theological political treatise is really to look at, how are we gonna balance indeed the theological aspects of society with the political aspects of society, and therefore it's actually filled with lots of biblical criticism. So he is very critical of many dogmas from the Bible there, which is also why people are like, he's an atheist. And I think that's also fairly readable, but you just have to be careful with that, because it's like, okay, like, what is he actually saying here, and is it really so simple that he's an atheist here? So I think from those three works, I would start with the emendation of the intellect. But honestly, I'm at a loss for words.
I'm very happy that you share your perspective, even though you're not an expert. I really appreciate it because I'd like to get to know Spinoza in the coming 2-3 weeks, let's say.
I'm gonna look it a little bit more up for you, and then
Yeah, please do, because then I can ask some nice questions if it comes up.
yeah.
Okay, that's great. I have one little bonus thing I'd like to discuss before we end off this chapter, which Stefan emailed me. But do you guys have any last words on Nietzsche and Goethe specifically?
So I just want to say, like, I definitely want to keep talking, but not now, like next time.
Well, we
Uh,
still could if you'd like. I could postpone this
well, I also no. I mean, like, just I want to keep
in
these
general.
conversations
Sounds
going.
good.
And actually, like, if we prolong this session too much, then, like, I think we're now like at a good flow. So I'm
Perfect.
definitely down for finishing this soon, but just talking soon.
Yeah.
And so Stefan, I'm curious if you agree,
No,
but
I agree. especially since, okay, this was just top of my head.
Right.
There's a lot more that I've already digested of Goethe, and a lot more that I've written down that I'm not aware of right now, but I know it's relevant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would have to, dive into that stuff again, because a lot of this conversation triggered my internal Goethe fan already. It's like, okay, let's talk about.
That's
That's
great. That's really good.
That's a good point to maybe end this
Yeah.
chapter then.
Yeah.
And
So,
I would also add like that. I also want to talk about Goethe, like his like his writing about color and all that. Like I'm very
yeah,
interested in that too.
yes,
A very different level, right?
yes.
And finally, I suggested like before we started recording to Lucas, like maybe it would also be fun to just read The Sorrows of Young Werther, because it's like a very short work, and also discuss that maybe at some
Oh,
future.
and it has it has some of the most beautiful passages I've
Yeah.
ever. If you look at how he relates macrocosm and microcosm to each other,
Right.
every and then that's where Leibniz's idea of what's it called, monad theory.
Really?
Yeah, he borrowed that from Leibniz and included
Oh,
that
yeah.
in the chapter of
Great.
macrocosm and microcosm, and that's a beautiful piece of art. So
Awesome.
I think it's really worth reading. Yeah.
By the way, as a fun fact, Leibniz also visited Spinoza in The Hague and in Leiden, because he was like, what's this thinker on about? And he was very much inspired by it, but he took a different route. So this is all related. Yeah.
Okay, amazing.
Yeah,
I,
Lucas, you said you wanted to finish it up with a bonus point?
yeah, a little bonus point because I asked Stefan if he had anything he'd like to talk about today, and he had one comment that I was very interested in, and I'll just read the quote. To quote Stefan, one issue that I find keeps recurring, though, is how unaware we are that, in brackets, while we come to appreciate Christianity as basic input-output system, is that correct? BIOS? Yeah, okay, good. Of Western modernity recently, again, thanks to Tom Holland, I find it fascinating that no one actually wonders how much and where our DNA has been reprogrammed due to enlightenment. Did you get that? I would give Stefan the opportunity to elaborate, and then you can respond.
So, long story short, I'm reading Peter Gay's Enlightenment, the Age of Modern Paganism, the creation of modern paganism. It's to me, it's one of the most fascinating books I've ever read. Point taken, not just about philosophy or in general, but it's the way he works and the meticulous work that went into that. It's just astonishing. If you look at his biographical essays at the end of that work, it's like 50, 60, 70 pages just writing down where he took what from and which sources he used. And it's not just, doing a literature review. It's much more intense than that. And so I think he's the most compelling author on the history of enlightenment. And he goes a long way to explain that enlightenment, as it were, mainly from the French thinkers, because the French thinkers were the most radical ones against state and against church. Not so much the British ones. They were pretty content with how state things and politics were going in general. Although they also were kind of critical to religion, but not as direct as the French thinkers. And so I actually got the idea for this question, or this observation, when I was listening to your podcast with your friend. What's his name?
Tajiro.
Yeah, Tajira, right. And so he asked the question, yeah, maybe the Bible is just a value set. And that's where I directly found a link to Peter Gay, because pre-enlightenment, no one would have thought about the idea that the Bible was simply a value set. So something must have happened back then, and then has been transported and continued in culture and society, that today we have this as the first idea when we see the Bible, or when we see any other religious text for that matter, and see, well, someone wrote something in there that is meant to be seen as a moral.
Yeah.
as just a kind of ethics, and not to be taken as an ontology or an epistemology of how to view the reality that we live in.
Yeah.
And I found that just fascinating, and I think it shows that enlightenment was so successful that we don't realize that we live in a post-enlightenment world.
Yeah.
Even though we still are Christians in a lot of senses. So that's something that maybe is left out of Tom Holland's Dominion, is the insane influence that the Enlightenment had on modernity and culture in general, and contrast that to the influence that Christianity had, because it's not just that Christianity was receding because of Enlightenment.
Yeah. I would also like, this is why I actually think that Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series is so helpful, because right, like he goes like he visits each time period and each, like not each, but many major thinkers in that time period or major traditions, and he shows like all of them are a piece of the puzzle, right?
Yeah.
And by doing so, he doesn't do like the normal thing where he says like, but Christianity wasn't that important, like he actually is like, no, Christianity was also super important. Just look at that, and Augustine, and then and then Plotinus, and then or Plotinus before Augustine, and then eventually Thomas Aquinas, like, so it was super important. But then also we see indeed, like after that, Romanticism and the Enlightenment and what comes about there. So that indeed is mostly, I think, the later episodes. Lucas, you might have a more fresh mind on this, but it's like Descartes, and it's a little bit of Kant, and it's Hegel, and it's Marx and Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. He discussed those. A little bit less so, by the way, some of the other Enlightenment thinkers that you would think. Like he discusses Kant very briefly. He discusses Hume not at all, I think. So like there are some Enlightenment thinkers that get no attention from me. He doesn't discuss Rousseau, who's both an Enlightenment thinker and an Enlightenment critic. So it's always kind of difficult to see that. But I do think, like, so I'm curious, Stefan, like, first of all, like, have you listened to all of those episodes? And I'm also curious, if so, like, do you think it gives you a better understanding of what happened during the Enlightenment?
I've listened to maybe a third of the lectures.
Right.
At one point, I found it too difficult to follow. I would have enjoyed it as a book.
Yeah,
it's coming, right?
He's gonna release a book, yeah.
Because I'm a very active reader, so I always have a pencil next to it, and start scribbling notes, side notes, or marking something, and then getting back to it. Just yesterday, I picked up Peter Gay again, and all I did was I've read the first 100 pages and I wanted to continue, but what I did was look back at what I had marked and what I commented on, and then there was like 1.5 hours later, I still hadn't reading the actual chapter. So this is what happens when I start reading a book. So I would love to do that with the work of Vervaeke, and there's so much video or talk available, but so little text.
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
it's true.
Which is, to me personally, a bit frustrating, because I think the only thing was like the zombie apocalypse, and that's it.
Yeah. I mean, like he's published tons of articles.
Work, sure. But if you look at the overarching story that the narrative that he's creating, is, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series, that still has not been distilled into one piece of.
Yeah.
No, I agree.
I would find that super helpful.
Yeah. He is indeed writing a book now, and let me see. I think
he was working on it with Chris as well.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, I actually found at some point he set out to. I think he said, like, you can now subscribe for the newsletter of his new website, and then you would get like an early copy. So like of the, like, so I have the PDF file in front of me now, but it's only the first 50 pages. So you can read through that, and it'll eventually be a work. So
I'll keep an eye out for it. For me, it was kind of a blessing, because Aron was like in our, I don't know if it was in our family group chats or just to us as siblings and my dad and stuff, being like, you have to watch this 50 episode series. And all of us kind of put it off, like, yeah, at some point I'll give it a go. And my sister, I remember, tried for a couple episodes and stuff. But if it wasn't for the video, I would have never started because I wasn't a reader when I was like a kid. So I think for some that helps. But for me to really integrate it, I think the One Piece would be extremely helpful as well.
Yeah,
But just
exactly.
for clarification for me, how many siblings are you?
Go ahead. What is it?
So there are 6 in total, including me. So that, yeah, we're 6 in total.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's fun.
How many siblings do you have, if you have
I
any?
have 2 sisters.
2 sisters?
2 sisters, a twin
Yeah.
sister and a younger sister.
Oh, yeah.
And how many children do you have currently?
I have 3 kids.
Oh yeah, nice. Okay, that's great. That's great. Are you getting 3 more, or is this?
No, sorry.
My parents, they went for 4.
I turned 40 this year, so
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
okay. That's fair. That's fair.
yeah.
No,
So,
my parents went for 4, I think. So
I do, yeah, exactly. Like, well, they went for 4, and then the last 2 came as extras. Just like this, to segue, like this bonus point we're discussing at the moment about the importance of enlightenment.
exactly.
I just briefly, like, I do think it's something that we can discuss a little bit more in depth next time. But one thing that I would say on the matter is, like, I'm not sure if there's just this one specific moment that ties to it, but it's definitely this overall rejection of tradition. And it sounds super, like, but I mean it is in like the most radical sense. So it's like, if you read Descartes' Meditations, he starts off saying, like, like, I have to take, like, everything that I know, I can't take that for granted anymore. So he's just introducing a completely different method, not just to religion, because that's often how it's, like, simplistically taken to be, like, enlightenment is science, as opposed to religion. It's like, no, but it's also about new ways of thinking that are far more important, which I think pertains far more importantly to your question, because then you get someone like Descartes, who's just like, we can do this in a different way. Like, we can apply those methods that were so successful in science and see if we can get something of that in our thinking. And then, when it then enters our thinking, because people then respond to Descartes, they think he posed a problem that needs to be solved, like a Spinoza, like a Leibniz, and then Hume, and then eventually Kant, and you get the whole rationalism and empiricism and them going against each other, and that's something we could talk about later. I have to teach it all the time anyway, so but
What do you think was really there in Descartes? Because once he had this realization, he went to a chapel and prayed a Hail Mary.
yeah, I know, but
I mean, that's just so funny for someone who's so in doubt about everything, that after he has this realization, goes off and says, well, thank God that you showed me.
yeah, but he is super religious, and for him it was like, like, so he has this whole existential aspect going on, right? So he has these nightmares of, like, oh no, like, what do I need to do? So he has just bad dreams, and that's why he starts writing the Meditations, to then indeed prove that God exists. And the ironic thing is that what people take from it is like, that proof actually isn't so great, which I actually agree with. It isn't the best proof of God that we can probably find. By the way, finding proof for God is something I find a bit iffy in general, but that's another topic altogether. But they just take the first part of it, which is like, let's just from epistemological principles find whatever we can know, right? And that is just doomed to fail, but no one knows it yet. So that just starts coloring everything, and that's why we just try to focus on, okay, all this extra qualitative stuff. Like, he even says it, like, that's why Goethe on color is so relevant, and I want to talk about it. But that qualitative stuff, that is just illusory. We shouldn't trust it. We should trust the principles of our mind, like, in the sense that we can know quantity and width and depth, and, like, and we have measurements for that. Like, that's really what's most important. And then you can also imagine that you'll look at a Bible story from that perspective and be like, get rid of all that, like, just focus on the main thing. What can we actually use from it still, like, today? And it's like, well, I guess it is a system of ethics, right? Because we have no ethics anymore. No one knows what's up or down, so let's just keep the ethics, because that's just clear. It's like, do not kill. Everyone knows what that means. And it's like, yeah, but most of religion is actually far more ambiguous, and it's not so simple as do not kill. And actually, Christ precisely entered the scene to make the rules also ambiguous, to be like, well, it's more about a transformation of the heart and not so much about following a set of rules, Mr. Peterson. But that's anyway.
He did come to mind as you were speaking.
Yeah, nice.
And this is really interesting because he was just in that video with Tammy.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Explaining the rosary, and that is such an interesting journey of hers. And you contrast that with him, and you can see he's slightly in discomfort at times during that video,
right?
Because he doesn't know what's happening there, and then he tries to find words for what's actually happening there and abstracting it, and remaining totally in the propositional, and she's totally participatory in that, and he cannot cross that bridge yet, and it's really funny to see.
Yeah, I know, and that's also like I actually have discussions with this about like with Lucas about this matter often. That it's also like Peterson is kind of like we wouldn't say it, but he's kind of this archetype of the era. Like he fulfills a purpose as this public persona almost, and he can't reconcile that with this inner transformation that is also clearly happening in some ways. And maybe that's just the way things are and how they're meant to be is a bit teleological, but that's just something that we need to accept. Just like Goethe became kind of this this figure of our imagination, but properly grounded in the historical figure, but then also that starts leading a life of its own. Same with Nietzsche, same with Jesus, by the way. Like all these figures, it's relevant. I'm not saying like Peterson is on that level yet, certainly not Jesus, but yeah. Okay, but let's talk about this more next time.
Einstein said that he had two heroes, Jesus and Goethe.
Really?
Yeah.
That's fascinating. And he said his God was Spinoza's God. So, yeah.
I think that's a wonderful place to wrap it up. This for me has been went so quick, and I feel honored to be able to sit in on what are for me two giants, as in the sense that I learned so much. It's like a kid to a parent, or the adult to the sage, in terms of sheer knowledge, and the connections you have together and the insights you get to together is really special. I'm excited to watch again and to talk again as well.
This is so fractal, by the way, right? Because it's like Stephan and I, like we're relating ourselves to like Nietzsche and Goethe, and then it's like you experience that to us, and then maybe someone listening to this is like, whoa, like what
I know.
It's like
it's the beauty of the modern age for me. I like it. Thank you, guys.
Lucas, you've been amazing at facilitating this conversation and steering it in a very nice direction, and preparing good questions also. And Stephan, yeah, I just want to if you're already on this from the top of your head, I want to definitely know more. Like, yeah.
And imagine we were together in one bar and had a beer. How that would turn out. That was
16 hours later.
Yeah, by the way, the uncensored version is going to be on Rumble later. No,
all right, guys, thank you so much. We'll plan it quickly, and I'll see you guys soon.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, guys. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Bye-bye.